The long-range scanner beeped at irregular intervals, but each time it was the space debris that Sixth Pasture was full of. In addition to the orbital destroyed during the Shondian War, the system was crammed with the remains of several satellites and planetoids blown up in the last major battle. Actually, this debris was almost as good for grazing as a broken orbital, so someone was always keeping herds on the Sixth and a few neighboring pastures. Usually, the herders had no trouble making arrangements. The shepherds were a close community, and the pastures in the system were very rich. There was enough for everyone, but this time it looked like someone has decided not to play by the rules. Andrew switched the scanner to offline mode. There was almost no hope of finding the lost cow, and his head was pulsating with pain from hours of staring at the screen. "I'm telling you, it's Crane," Pavo said. "He's been telling everybody he's going to the 11th, but instead, sneaking around here, stealing cattle from the neighbors. There have been rumors about him for a long time. Bad rumors." Andrew stood up, wincing in pain, went to the medicine cabinet and took out a pack of painkillers. Slapping an osmotic pad on the bend of his elbow, he poured himself a cup of coffee and looked at his partner. Pavo sat in his decrepit, ugly chair, resting his long legs on the console. As always, there were no emotions on his face. But Andrew knew Pavo was no less worried than he was. They had already lost their third cow in a week. A couple more and they can forget about any profit, and they will be lucky if they can jump out of this situation without serious losses. "No one has ever caught Crane red-handed," Andrew said. "Not a single piece of evidence, not even circumstantial. Even now we have nothing but speculation. He'll laugh at us, and he'll be right. And what if we're wrong, and he has nothing to do with it?" The medicine began to take effect, and Andrew blissfully felt the throbbing pain subside. Pavo sighed and set the mug on the edge of the panel. "Then we'll have to find something more substantial than speculation," he said. "Let's round up the herd." Andrews and Pavo's herd consisted of 24 specialized von Neumann probes, or provones, or, as the shepherds called them, cows. In fact, each cow was a huge automaton designed for one thing only: to collect and process everything useful that could be found in the eternal cold of outer space. Of course, the classical idea of von Neumann probes as an autonomous, self-replicating research ship, for all its romantic aura, had extremely dubious commercial value. What use can be made of devices that would wander from one star to another for thousands of years, leisurely digesting an asteroid or two in the process? But the interstellar war that broke out 2 centuries ago and drew several powerful civilizations into its vortex left behind many systems filled with the wreckage of giant artificial structures, orbitals, Dyson rings, shipyards, and the like. Big tasty debris containing many of the rarest materials was just waiting to be picked up and shipped to where they were needed most. That's when the idea of probes proposed back in the long-gone 20th century was revived. Instead of research probes, slow as space currents, you can make a whole herd of provones, which will graze on the ruins of giant fragments of the great past, accumulate useful materials, and sometimes even give the offspring, that is, build their copies from these materials. You don't need numerous prospecting fleets. You don't need huge freighters to transport collected stuff. You just need to drive your herd into a suitable pasture, and then you can collect the litter and distribute it for processing. But if someone starts stealing your livestock, you may well go bankrupt. And fast. Good provons were expensive. Are you sure it's Crane? Akihita's face was completely blank, but Andrew knew it was a sign that he was overcome with emotion. Akihita claimed to be from an ancient samurai family, descended from some famous Japanese warlord, after whom he was named. Normally, he was quite cheerful and sympathetic. His cheekbones stiffened only when any other man would have been half a step away from a violent burst of rage. I've already lost 6 cows. 2 of them were about to calve. Akihita was silent for a moment. His eyes were aflame, but his face was a marble mask. I'll text you the latest coordinates of all the missing ones. Maybe, if we cross-reference our data, we can determine where the thief might be. He nodded, held out his hand, and the communication screen went out. Andrew could barely keep from whistling. Akihita and his partner, Pereira, had only recently started their venture. The license for grazing in the Zunada system had eaten up their last savings, and their herd was relatively small, only 24 provons. To lose a quarter of the herd in one fell swoop, at a time when you have not yet paid off not only the cows, but even the license. Andrew was already contemplating which of his shepherd friends he could persuade to cash in for Akihita, so that the rookie shepherd would not go bankrupt. The shepherds were a closed caste, despised by the proud military spacemen and even the merchants, but they were usually stuck together pretty tight. Occasionally, however, there were types like Crane. No one had ever been able to prove anything, but he was suspected of all the deadly sins of shepherds: stealing other people's cattle, unlicensed grazing, including on other people's pastures, and a host of lesser offenses. He was even raided a couple of times, but Crane always managed to slip away like wet soap, leaving no evidence behind. Unfortunately, the stock buyers were not as united and loyal as shepherds, so Crane was sure to have no trouble selling his ill-acquired goods. And now it looked like he was finally getting some heat, and he could be nailed. Andrew typed a command on the terminal, and the three-dimensional holographic map of the system appeared in front of him, on which all the pastures were marked. In the 7th pasture, red lights marked the last known coordinates of the missing cows from Akihita's herd. The pasture zone was a giant ring around the Zunada star, sliced into 12 truncated sectors, the pastures. The 11th pasture, where Crane supposedly grazed his herd, was far away, on the other side of the star. But who would take a word of such a slippery fella for granted? Andrew entered the coordinates of his lost cows into the simulator, marking them in green, and turned the hologram around to get a better look at the neighboring 6th and 7th pastures. There it was. He entered a few more commands and clapped the arm of his chair triumphantly. Behind Andrew's back, Pavo entered the bridge. "I've rounded up the herd," he said. "I turned off their targeting, so they'd be more tightly packed, and mirror it to our navigator. So far, they're drifting behind us at triple normal range." Pavo paused and bent over Andrew's shoulder. "Got anything?" he asked. Andrew pointed to the hologram. "I contacted Akihita," he said. "You know he drove his herd to the 7th, right? Well, he is missing some cows too. He gave me the coordinates, so I synchronize everything, and this is what I got. The scale is all wrong, it's just for illustrative purposes. The X zone is actually much smaller. The ring of the grazing zone on the diagram was marked with different colors for each pasture. The sixth was marked in blue, the seventh in yellow. Along the borders of each sector, several dots glowed red. According to Andrew's commands, the computer plotted the surface against these dots, producing something that looked like a highly flattened hemisphere. Pavo took a closer look. Wait, that's... Andrew nodded. A paraboloid. And the one who steals cows from us is sitting exactly in its focus point. He shook his head. I'll be damned, but the guy has some nerve. He doesn't even move. He just hangs out above the ecliptic, like a fisherman over an ice hole, and just keeps on hooking. But now we're gonna shut him down for good. Pavo straightened up. I'll warm up the geosector engines, he said. You contact Akihita. I think he'll want to join our friendly visit too. Andrew tapped the button on the communication device. It was time for Crane to pay all his bills. Although the Zunada system as a whole had long since been cleansed of war elements and was considered safe, the battle that had been fought there was in the final stages of the war, when both the Shondi Empire and its allies and the Second Federation had reached the point of exhaustion and thus desperation. As a result, both sides began to resort to methods of warfare that were considered unseemly during the civilized period of the war. It came down to biological weapons, gravitational vortexes that turned entire planets into piles of rubble, and even, according to rumors, black swarms of self-replicating nanobots. However, the latter were rumors, and it was impossible to ask the warring sides, trapped in stasis by the intervening elder civilizations. Therefore, in places like the Zunada system, the shepherds, and there were not too many other visitors in such a god-forsaken corner of the galaxy, tried to stay within the grazing zone. Crane must have taken advantage of this, positioning himself above the ecliptic and hijacking the control of other people's prevones with some pirate equipment. It had been a convenient location since no one had ever taken an interest in the void above the ring, but now it was working against Crane himself. In the debris-free space, it was impossible to disguise oneself as a broken orbital defense monitor or a shard of orbital platform. Andrew and Akihita had devised a plan to go into short hyperjump, taking both herds with them, and drop out into standard space literally at stone's throw from Crane's position. Whatever defense system he had, it wouldn't be able to handle a solid 50 targets dropping in on him at once. After all, it was just a shepherd ship, albeit a pirate one, not a battle cruiser. Crane had been asking for it for a long time. The calculations proved accurate, and both ships, the Highlander and Akihita's Tsurumaru, surrounded by their respective herds, simultaneously arrived at the set distance from the pirate paraboloid. And at the focus was the Chergi, Crane's ship. But gods, what a state it was in! No one answered him, neither Andrew nor Akihita and Pereira, all staring at Crane's ship. Chergi was a typical shepherd ship, long, massive hull studded with variety of antennas and outgrowths of instrument blisters, with an ugly cluster of geosector engines at its stern. There were no mooring devices on it, and they were not needed. The cows were usually twice or even 3 times the size of their shepherds and were controlled remotely. But now, Chergy looked like a piece of Swiss cheese, especially rich in holes. And chewed by mice, too. The engines were the worst hit. In fact, there was almost nothing left of them, as if someone or something had chopped off several weighty pieces, along with nutrient cores and the antimatter capsules. Some thought was scrambling just around the corner, but Andrew couldn't grasp it, distracted by the sight of monstrously mangled Chergy. Paavo was fiddling with the long-range optics system, staring intently at the screen. The standard view cameras were too weak to see details, like what had happened to the crew's living area and control room. Ostensibly, there wasn't much damage visible where they were, but... Satana perkele, Paavo suddenly said. Looks like we're too late. Someone's already taken care of Crane. What is it? Akihita asked impatiently. He didn't have a powerful optical system on his ship, and he didn't know Paavo well enough to know that he only started swearing in Finnish in the most urgent cases. Andrew turned his chair around and looked at the screen. At a distance of about 5 or 6 clicks from the Chergy, slowly rotating, drifted Ashton Crane himself. Frozen to stone, spacesuitless, and obviously and irrevocably dead. After a while, they got closer to Chergy and saw something they hadn't noticed at first. The crew area and control sector had actually been damaged as well, just not as drastically compared to the total devastation of the tail section. There was a gaping hole where the deckhouse had been, with some twisted and torn structures vaguely visible in the depths, and a similar hole, only slightly smaller, in the living area. Next to each of the holes drifted a cloud of debris, an inevitable companion of space disasters. Furniture torn from its seats, broken instruments, and the crew's personal belongings. However, the Crane was the only Chergy crew member. Unlike most shepherds, who usually worked in pairs, the old pirate preferred to carry out his dubious enterprises alone. At least he hadn't brought anyone with him on his last trip through outer space. But what the hell happened here? Who could have attacked the Chergy in this remote corner of the galaxy? Interstellar warfare was a thing of a distant past. The elder civilizations, having categorically ended the Second Shondian War, had made it clear that they would no longer tolerate any squabbling beyond the atmosphere. Even pirates like Crane weren't really true pirates. They were more like thieves and hijackers. Andrew and Akihita weren't going to resort to violence either. The plan was to use the surprise factor to block Crane's escape with 2 herds, dock at the Chergy, punch the crook in the face, and force him to return the stolen cows, nothing more. Andrew looked once more at the mangled ship, which looked like some poor animal that had inadvertently fallen into a river full of piranhas. An elusive thought again rustled somewhere nearby. Andrew, Akihita sounded worried. There are multiple signals on the scanners approaching us. No response. Estimated contact time is 12 minutes. Andrew threw a quick glance at the screen of his scanner. Indeed, about a dozen objects were approaching them, from the void outside the ecliptic and approaching fast. Crane's associates? No way. The existence of 1 or 2 pirates was maybe conceivable, but an entire fleet was utterly out of question. Some kind of Shondian warships or the opponents. Even more nonsense. In more than 2 centuries, there could hardly be anything left in the system but wreckage and ruins. Andrew looked at Crane's ship, and it occurred to him again that it looked half-eaten or something. And then it hit him. "Pereira, does your herd have a proactive search mode?" Andrew asked. Pereira was not visible on the screen, but Andrew knew he was sitting next to Akihita. The Brazilian was in charge of cow programming at Tsurumaru. "Yes," came Pereira's voice. "But you understand that I didn't tell you that. Officially, a proactive search was strictly forbidden. Because the cows switched to this mode instead of calm and leisurely processing of dead ships and orbital ruins, began to chase all over the system for any interesting object, including fully functional ships. If the License Commission found even a trace of such programming on a cow, its owner would have to find a new way to make a living." "We don't have time for explanation now," Andrew said. "So, here's what I want you to do. Put the whole herd into proactive mode, orient it towards these guests, and set the hibernation timer for, let's say, 15 minutes. Yeah, that should be enough. And, most importantly, once you've done all that, burn out all the communication circuits on each cow." "Wait a moment, we can't just..." Akihita started, but Andrew cut him off. "Not now, there is no time. If we don't do it, we'll end up just like Rain, believe me. We'll figure out how to get out of this later. But for now, just do it." Akihita nodded at Pereira's unintelligible muttering from somewhere behind him. Andrew turned to Pavo, who met him with a nod. "Already done," he said calmly. "I figured it out too, while you were talking." He pointed to the scanner screen, where 28 dots, the whole herd, were unfolding toward the approaching objects in an umbrella. "I hope we are right. Otherwise..." Andrew shrugged his shoulders. "We'll know in a few minutes," he said. "So our own cows tried to attack us?" Akihita asked. "I can't believe that's even possible." The 4 of them were sitting in the Highlander's wardroom. The low table was littered with full and empty beer cans. Pavo had gutted his entire reserve on the occasion of the salvation. "Yeah," Andrew said. "Crane was one hell of a smart bastard. And an excellent programmer. But this time he'd outsmarted himself. He'd been able to hijack the Provone's controls before, but chasing every cow around the system and risking getting caught wasn't very efficient. So he reprogrammed the stolen cows. He probably had 2 or 3 of them at first, so that they could alter the behavior of other Provones. Just a little bit, 'cause they are really short on brains, but still enough for his purposes. And then they started attacking anyone, including their master?" Pereira asked, opening a new can. "Not exactly," Pavo answered. "I've already downloaded the code from one of reprogrammed cows. Relax, not into Highlander mainframes, and certainly not into some cow," he said to Pereira, who choked on his beer. "To the secure isolated system in my quarters. I have to admit, the work is masterful. What would you think Crane implemented into the stolen cows? Honestly, I would never have guessed that. A herd instinct." "But they are already got it, don't they?" Akihita asked. "Like any cow." Andrew finished his beer and put the can on the table. "Actually, we only call them that," he said. "But in reality, of course, They're 1,000 times more stupid than any real cow, and they have no instincts. No more than, say, a colony of bacteria. Absorb resources and reproduce. That's all they can do. But Crane somehow managed to cram something much more complex into their puny software. And he must have screwed up, Pavo said. His rewired provolnes were acting like alpha males, taking control of our cows and driving them back here, where Crane was brainwashing them. But apparently he overdid it, coded into them too much aggression and initiative, and either didn't care or didn't have enough space for control circuits. Probably he thought that if he could name himself as a super alpha male, he would be safe. But somehow he lost sight of the fact that these were not real ungulates, but robots with very primitive electronic brains. So his bulls at some point decided that it was time to take the power away from the old male and rule the herd themselves. Everyone thought about it for a while. At the cost of some losses, the thinned herds of both herding teams managed to stop and neutralize the crazy cows. 4 cows, 3 from Andrew's and Pavo's herd, and 1 from Akihita's, had to be scrapped, but the rest were expected to recover, including the stolen ones after Pavo and Pereira had scrubbed all the malicious Crane code from their processors and memory. One of the great virtues of the provolnes was their ability to self-repair, if only they had the materials. Crane's body lay in one of the empty compartments of the Highlander, depressurized to preserve the remains of the hapless rogue. As for the Chergi, its fate was really short-term now. The 2 herds will soon consume the remains of the ship. Counting all the odds, we got off easy, Pavo said. It's scary to think what would have happened if Andrew had not guessed at the very last moment. What? He asked, looking at Andrew's suddenly pale face. What are you? Did something else occur to you? Yes, Andrew said, playing mindlessly with the clasp of his overalls. I was thinking, the elders forbade wars and weapons production, right? And it's just occurred to me. Our cows, they have high-powered lasers to cut through old hulls, gravity resonators to work with nutrid and other such materials, force field traps for capsizing and storing antimatter. We thought they were too dumb to be feared. But then came the proactive mode. And now, the Crane's coding. Oh shit, Pereira said slowly. Akihita shifted his gaze from one person to the other in incomprehension. Andrew nodded. We haven't fought a war in over 2 centuries. Not even small conflicts. We have practically forgotten what war is. And suddenly, it turns out that without realizing it, we have created a huge semi-autonomous battle fleet capable of self-reproduction. You remember the big boogeyman the elders used to scare everyone with after throwing 8 star systems out from our continuum? The Black Swarm, Pavo said. But that's just a legend, isn't it? Akihita crumpled the empty can in his fist and tossed it into the corner. Looks like we just found out it's not a legend anymore, he said, looking at the view screen as if he expected the stars to start going out any minute.